On the agenda tonight, we're going to be discussing a comment made by Quincy Jones about the Beatles. Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another video. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. So this is something that I get asked about now and again, and it falls within the same brackets, I think, of the video that I did on Buddy Rich and his comments about Glenn Campbell and the fact that he didn't think that Glenn was very talented and all that kind of stuff, and people really didn't understand that. Obviously, people are confused about it because you've got somebody with Quincy's reputation and his history making this comment about, I think, what a lot of people class as the best band that there's ever been. So I think the first thing to get an appreciation of is that being an instrumentalist is totally different to being in a band. So what I'm saying here is, when you're talking about instrumentalists who have only worked at playing that instrument, for example, let's take Eddie Van Halen, who worked at playing the guitar, worked at techniques of tapping, took it to a totally different level, and that's what he was focusing on. So you get instrumentalists who focus on playing an instrument, and I think that's not something that the Beatles did. They worked at melody, and when you talk about, Paul McCartney and John Lennon and their songwriting ability, they were working at writing songs and coming up with melodies that they could sing together and harmonize with each other. So it means that their focus isn't on playing an instrument to the top level. Something that I've said on the channel multiple times in the past is that loads of the biggest hits across all time have not been technical masterpieces by somebody who's just playing a particular piece on the guitar, for example, that's, loads of notes every second, and it's really technical, alternate picking, sweep picking. Humans store melodies slowly. And more often than not, when you do have an instrumental section in a huge hit, it is something that you can repeat vocally because it's not that technical. It isn't, 10, 15 notes per second. It's at a speed that we can relate to from a speaking perspective. So it means that it's a conversation, you can understand it. So when you're thinking about a conversation, you're never going to be talking to somebody who is saying 15 words per second. And you wouldn't even be able to decipher what they're on about because there'd be too many words. Unless you're going for a world record attempt, in which case it's not about being understood, it's about trying to say as many words as possible. And that's the thing about playing an instrument. If you're playing lots of notes all the time, it's not going to be understood. You've got to make what you're saying understandable in a way that humans understand, which is a conversation, and that happens at a very particular speed. And once you've kind of got the appreciation of that, again, it's putting that into a song and making it melodic, as well as getting the cadence right for the notes that you are singing and the lyrical content of the song, all that kind of stuff. It's a very complicated thing. And this is something that the Beatles just had the ability to do, to write great songs. So it meant that they didn't need top level technical ability. One thing that I will say is that the way they could harmonize with each other was technically very good. They were great singers independently, but then blending their voices, especially live when they couldn't even hear their own voices, they just did a great job of it all the time. So now, when Quincy is forming his opinion of anybody, it's always going to be subjective, which means he's just calling on his past history and knowledge of musicians, which would have been, no doubt, some of the best session players ever to have lived. When we're talking about, producing Michael Jackson and the Thriller album, when we take that into consideration, he's going to be working with the best players in the world. So this means that for session musicians, the whole point, or your aim as a session musician, is to go in to a studio and play what is being requested of you once. Ideally, that's the goal, is to be able to play anything somebody wants you to play immediately and play it to a level where it's just one take and that's it. They then move on with their project. When you imagine Quincy being behind the desk in the studio and getting in a session musician, He would be used to guys that might be able to just nail it in one take, or might be able to just nail it in maybe 5 or 10 minutes. So they have a few takes. They might even want to get a different kind of vibe with one take to the next. But it doesn't mean that the session musician is playing it incorrectly lots of times. They're just getting slightly different feel every time. So this is what Quincy certainly would have been used to. Just somebody coming in and producing the goods. The thing about being a session musician is it's hyper competitive, because if you're the guy that can do it in one take, then you're going to get hired all the time, because it means that you are the cheapest person to employ by the record label. Imagine that they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on an album, and the studio time for that album, time costs money. So it means that being in that studio, you could literally look at a clock on the wall. Instead of a clock, you could look at a dollar sign with a number next to it, and you can see that going up and up and up and up. So the longer you're in that studio, the more it's going to cost for the record label, and the more inconvenient it's going to be. I mean, it's almost like a community of great session players, like the Wrecking Crew back in the day. There were just particular people who are almost like a band of session musicians. You might have 10 or 15 people that are just the go-to people to play on albums, one after the next after the next. But anyway, to put this all in context, I know that it all centers around when Quincy was working with Ringo Starr. And Ringo had a 4-bar, maybe it was a fill, maybe it wasn't a fill, it might have just been 4 bars of a particular song that he was playing his drum beat to, and he wanted a particular feel but wasn't nailing it, and it was taking quite a long time to do it. And I think it was a matter of hours, as in maybe 2 to 3 hours, in order to record 4 bars. So from Quincy's perspective, he's used to people being able to nail something in 1 take, maybe 2 takes, probably 3 takes, and you'd be fired. So he's used to getting it done and then moving into the production side. So if his workflow is delayed or interrupted by 2 or 3 hours, you can understand that's going to be frustrating, because he's not used to that. But by the same token, Ringo Starr will be used to getting everything how he wants to get it. So yeah, it took a few hours, and actually after a few hours, I know from what I've read that Quincy said to Ringo to have a break, and maybe he's just overthinking it because it's taking so long, to go away and maybe eat something and then come back. And in the time that Ringo was away, Quincy got in another drummer, a jazz drummer, in order to get down what Ringo was struggling with. And when Ringo came back, they didn't tell him that somebody else had played it. And Ringo asked just to hear it back, to get back in that place. And then Ringo listened to it and thought, oh, well, that's not so bad. So maybe I'm just being a little bit too strict with it, And they didn't tell Ringo that, it was somebody else drumming. So it's very much about the perception and the subjective perception of another musician from what you're used to. And I'm sure that, to Quincy, because he works with just the best, that would have looked like and seemed like the worst musicians in the world, or the worst musician in the world. But obviously, the Beatles were far from that. I think there are a lot of musicians who would not be able to do certainly what the Beatles did live, with harmonising and just producing an authentic version of their songs live, because that's a huge part of artistry and being a band. And again, it's not necessarily under the heading of just being an instrumentalist. I think calling them the worst musicians in the world, musician can cover so many things. So I think had he said that they weren't, well, again, it's how you phrase it, they weren't the best instrumentalists that I've ever worked with. If he'd said that, then maybe that would have been better. But Quincy is who Quincy is, so he's just going to tell it how it is and how he feels about it. Because, even with Michael Jackson, Michael didn't spend ages working at one instrument and getting that down to an amazing level. Michael made noises with his mouth showing what he wanted, so that then it meant that you needed a session person to come in and be able to do what Michael was imitating with his voice, not only melodically, but sometimes, beatboxing and doing all that kind of stuff. So yeah, even on that side of things, certainly working with Michael Jackson, it meant that Quincy would have been working with just the top level session musicians day in, day out. And there's probably, what is fair to say that you can probably get used to that, thinking that that's the base level, that these people who are playing something instantly and nailing it, that's just what they do. So yeah, bit of a reality check when then other musicians come in that haven't been spending that amount of time working at their instrument. But anyway, it's always interesting to have a discussion video now and again, so you guys can get involved in the comments section and let me know what you think. But certainly, because this was such a high profile producer and such a high profile band, a lot of people couldn't relate one comment to the other and understand where this has actually come from in the first place. So I can see it from both sides, really, that you've got a band who just want to get everything to sound exactly how they want it to, which takes time, and then you've got somebody working who gets everything done as quickly as possible, working with real top talent. But there's no way that you can say anything about the Beatles not being great at what they did. And I would say that they were great musicians, because I class being a great musician as having an appreciation of melody and harmonies and writing good songs. And it's not all about technical ability of playing an instrument, it's about the total package of playing live, nailing it live, and being able to play the instruments to the level that they do in the studio and replicate that in a live setting. The Beatles were certainly one of those bands that could absolutely do that night after night. So yeah, I think that they were great musicians. But if I was saying about them being great instrumentalists, then I'd say that they weren't just focusing on playing their instruments, they were focusing on lots of other things at the same time. So yeah, they certainly weren't session players. But anyway, thank you guys for asking me this question and asking for me to address it. Hopefully it makes it a little bit clearer to those of you that can't really equate that point of view from Quincy Jones. But as always, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Keep those suggestions and requests coming for future videos. And if you did enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And I'll catch you guys at the next one. Rock!